Multiplayer will be coming to Cyberpunk, but it won't be coming to Cyberpunk 2077, despite many players believing that they will buy Cyberpunk 2077 once it's released, and CD Projekt Red will just push a free update that will add online to Cyberpunk 2077. This is not going to happen. So in this video, I am going to be going through everything so that at the end of it, you should understand the ins and outs of multiplayer coming to Cyberpunk. If you do want to see me streaming Cyberpunk when this game does finally release, then there is a link in the description down below which will take you over to Twitch. Head over to there, drop a follow, and you'll be notified the next time I go live. In addition to this, you will be able to find all my socials within the description. So if there's anything else that you fancy connecting, you will find it all down there. Getting back into the video, CD Projekt Red have confirmed that multiplayer will be coming. This goes all the way back to a tweet that they pushed out on September 4th, 2019. It says, "Until now, the only thing we said about multi was that it was in R&D. As we're getting closer to launching single player Cyberpunk 2077 in April 2020, we'd like to confirm that multiplayer is in the works. If you feel like lending us your skills, apply here." Now this was a tweet back in September 2019, and because this was before they delayed the game, they're still obviously talking about April, and this was actually a job advert. So if you did click the link, it will take you to CD Projekt's employment, in which you can apply for jobs. There is also a follow-up to this tweet which gives us a bit more information. The plan for now is to deliver Cyberpunk 2077 in April, then follow up with DLCs, brackets free, and single player content, and once we're done, invite you for some multiplayer action. So from this, we instantly know that CD Projekt Red is planning to release Cyberpunk 2077, give us downloadable content, and then once all of that is done, that's when multiplayer will be available. At this point, when this information was released about multiplayer coming, news articles went absolutely mental, releasing so much news, and this has resulted in causing some confusion. We see titles from The Verge which says Cyberpunk 2077 is getting multiplayer after launch, and even though this is somewhat true, it's not actually Cyberpunk 2077. This was later cleared up. In a Games Radar interview, we did have Michael Nokowski who did talk about multiplayer coming. It says, "In terms of multiplayer, one thing we need to make clear is the AAA release we're working on in parallel with Cyberpunk 2077 is Cyberpunk multiplayer." This was a quote back when Cyberpunk did get delayed for the first time, and it was talking about the other projects that they're working on as well as Cyberpunk 2077. With this quote just here, we can see that Cyberpunk multiplayer is completely separate to Cyberpunk 2077. That's why they're working as a separate AAA release parallel with Cyberpunk 2077, and not as something that is conjoined and not something that will be an add-on later. And with my research going through everything that's been pushed on Twitter by CD Projekt Red underneath the Cyberpunk channel as well, they've never actually stated they're bringing multiplayer to Cyberpunk 2077, just that a Cyberpunk multiplayer is in the works. So this means that Cyberpunk 2077 will remain a single player open world role-playing game. There will be content updates for Cyberpunk 2077, including free DLC which we've already spoke about on this channel, and there will also be 2 massive expansions, which will most likely be paid. This is very similar to what CD Projekt Red have done with The Witcher, but that would be everything for Cyberpunk 2077 unless they have a huge amount of success with one of these expansions and decide to go and bring out another one. Things are still up for changing, but as things currently go, that's not apparently in the works. But what is in the works is a completely separate standalone AAA project that is Cyberpunk multiplayer. And this will not be added to Cyberpunk 2077 in the future, it will just be its own standalone game. And I think for a lot of players, they may find this kind of upsetting. What a lot of players were hoping for was something similar to what GTA 5 had with GTA Online, and also Red Dead Redemption 2 had with Red Dead Online, where the game was released at first, but a month later, that is when the online component was added. It was also a free add-on to the game, rather than having to pay to play it. But the way that CD Projekt Red are doing things has got me very excited for the future. It means that they can put full focus onto Cyberpunk 2077 as a single player game, and later they can put full focus on Cyberpunk multiplayer as a multiplayer game. What I mean by this is the problems that you can see within the GTA and also the Red Dead Redemption communities. And I am someone that does belong within Red Dead Redemption. That is my favorite game right now. And I do have a YouTube channel going through the ins and outs on everything to do with Red Dead Redemption 2 and Red Dead Online. But as a player that's around a lot of players that are massive fans of Red Dead Redemption 2, fans have just been crying out for some single player DLC. But Rockstar refused to do that because they're pushing more to online. So what you start to see is that a game will have a single player component and a multiplayer component, but the game studio will focus on one or the other. Whereas the way that CD Projekt Red are doing things, they are two completely separate games. And they're also releasing at two separate times. And on top of that, we do already know, as already mentioned, that the single player will have single player updates, and the multiplayer, even though we do not know too much, as a separate entity will probably have updates as well. Now that we've cleared all of that up, the next probably major question that you're asking is, why is this happening? Why isn't multiplayer just an add-on? As said, there is already some benefits to having them as completely separate games, but speculation within the Cyberpunk community is that CD Projekt Red have already stated that Cyberpunk 2077 will not have any microtransactions. This would make business very hard if CD Projekt Red plan to release a free multiplayer component whilst also funding the evolution of the game without having any new streams of revenue. At least with the sales of Cyberpunk 2077 when it's released, that money can then be used to fund the new DLCs that will be coming, and if they then release the separate component, the separate game being Cyberpunk multiplayer, that money that came from players buying that game will then be used to fund the multiplayer. That is also if Cyberpunk multiplayer doesn't have any microtransactions as well. Just having them as two separate things just splits the revenue, meaning that each one can fund itself. Because let's be honest, both of these, being Cyberpunk 2077 and also Cyberpunk multiplayer, will be incredibly popular, especially with the hype that is already around Cyberpunk single player. Another theory that's been thrown around is that Cyberpunk multiplayer is just that big of a game. We don't know the ins and outs of it yet, but we do know that Cyberpunk 2077 single player is massive and ridiculously in depth. I really doubt that CD Projekt Red are just going to drop the ball here and make something very lackluster. They're going to be trying to raise that bar again. I'm gonna go and throw my opinion out there and say that multiplayer is most likely going to be similar to the story, in the sense that players can expect the first person action of a single player component. It is unlikely that CD Projekt Red will release a free-for-all or a team deathmatch game mode. We're sort of expecting a cyberpunk twist on the likes of GTA Online. And I'm sure with all of this information, the next big question is, when will this be released? The release date has not yet been confirmed, but has been talked about being 2022, 2 years after the release of Cyberpunk 2077. And this comes from CD Projekt Red themselves. At first, when the multiplayer component was revealed on the 4th of September, within that tweet, they were talking for a release within 2021. But going back to that Games Radar interview back when Cyberpunk was delayed, it does say here, given the expected release of Cyberpunk 2077 in September, and frankly speaking the series of events which we expect to occur after that date, 2021 appears unlikely as a release date for Cyberpunk multiplayer. That has led players having their fingers crossed for 2022. But as said, this is still very early days, and it seems that CD Projekt Red do have a plan for Cyberpunk 2077, with free DLC as well as paid DLC coming to the game, and a single player component is a priority as of right now, with multiplayer being one of those extra things later on. But anyway, that is what we know about Cyberpunk multiplayer, and I want to throw this question over to you guys. Are you excited for a multiplayer version of Cyberpunk, or don't you really care? Are you more interested in the single player? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you do want to talk more in depth about Cyberpunk, I am streaming over on Twitch every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, so if you do want to pop in and just talk about Cyberpunk, then there is a link to that in the description down below. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did enjoy, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, but for now, I'm going. So see ya.